Rob, I'm recording. Okay, we're recording.
Now that's the difference.
I'm going to do two things. I'm actually prepared two things. One is the Gemara. The other one is there was a letter that the President sent out about 2 or 3 days ago. I don't know if you got it, if you're on any of their mailing with them. I'm gonna show that letter as well. Because the funny thing is, the letter is based on our Gemara. But anyways,
he was a name. He helped in
Bacher called me in this region here.
People contacted him.
Okay. Are we ready to roll? Everybody? L'chaim, attention. And then he said, ladies and gentlemen, if we can have everybody's attention, there's 2 things that I want to do tonight, so we better get going because we got to.
We're not talking about halachot.
Sorry? Halachot chofesh. The halachot chofesh are. You can do that on one leg. You know, like the guy that said to Hillel, what's the term? The halachot chofesh are that all the halachot when it's not chofesh apply, even when it's chofesh. They still apply. But what I wanted to look at, gentlemen, what I wanted to look at today, and I think I saved the text here somewhere. A letter went out. Can you see that over there? Is that coming up over there, Les? Everybody on Zoom?
Where are we?
We're looking at a letter. We're going to go to 37 in a moment. But I thought it's quite fortuitous that the Johannesburg Besdin sent out a letter like 2 or 3 days ago. I don't know how many of you got it. Did you see the letter about the tuna? And right, about the tuna. You'll see it now. It's on your screen, Rabbi Slatsky. But I thought it was quite amazing. You'll see now. I've got it on the share screen. But the reason why it's important for us, the reason why it's relevant to this shiur, is because most of the sources in that letter come from exactly where we are. Yeah. Just we're about to get there, but a lot of the concepts have already been exactly. Okay, no problem. So we're just going to have a quick look at this letter before we get going. Because we came up with a lot of these things in our Gemara. So it's quite fascinating to see a letter. And most of the issues that the letter deals with is most of the issues that this letter deals with are dealt with in our Gemara. Because like just placing it in context, we already said that our Gemara is obviously the launch pad, the platform was the fact that the Gemara was talking about Avodah Zarah. That's the tractate about idolatry. And based on the wine libations, the idolatrous offerings for which wine was used, the Gezeira, the rabbinic decree of Yain Nesach, of wine that is poured for idolatry, came about, that we can't use wine that comes from the Goyim, from the Gentiles, the Gentile idolaters, the Ovdei Kochovim around us. And then also, the Gemara started to discuss all of the allied decrees that happened at the same time, as we've said many times. There was a decree on the bread, and there was a decree that's pas akum, bread that is baked by Gentiles. And then there was even oil. There was shemen akum, which was a decree that was later rescinded by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. We spoke about that. And then there was the decree on milchiks, on dairy, kvina, and chalav, on cheese, and milk. And then there was bishul akum in general, cooking by a Gentile or a non-Jew, which is a lot of it was based on our Mishnah. In fact, we're coming up to the next Mishnah. We're on the last, we've got about 2 pages left of Gemara that will discuss this Mishnah that we're on. And this is exactly the Mishnah that he was talking about over there. And what he wrote is an essay. I mean, we'll just look at some of the concepts before we go into the text of our Gemara, because interestingly, these concepts are exactly on a par with what we're busy with. It talks over there about, he writes over there why it is, people often ask a question. I've heard it many times. Why are there different levels? Why would it be that you can have shchitter of meat that's like this and a shchitter that's like that, people often wonder, I never heard them ask why you can have a BMW and a Toyota. Why can't everybody just drive the same car? Because God created a world where there's different kinds of cars. And some people want to order an Uber Black, which is an executive Uber, and someone else is happy to go in an Uber Go or an Uber X, and it's fine. It gets him from point A to B. So there's lots of these why questions have come up over time. And one of the questions people might ask, I've even asked it myself sometimes, is why two types of tin tuna? Why does the kashrut authorities in Johannesburg give us two options when it comes to tin tuna? Tuna is a very important staple, certainly in other parts of the world.
High in protein. Eh?
High in protein and mercury.
Yeah.
Become very popular even in South Africa. And you get certain cans of tuna that will say on them, Bishul Yisrael, that this has been cooked by Jews, Bishul Yisrael. Bishul means to cook, and Yisrael means an Israelite or a Jew. And then you get the regular tuna that's based in Parav. And he took the trouble to list out in a very descriptive way exactly what it is that is the differential between these two different types. And it's not to say that anybody's wrong one way or the other. That's why he says that if you want to know what to do, speak to your rabbi, because each person's rabbi might know his circumstances. Is it important for him to pay a few rand less? It's a consideration, by the way. Torah chas b'mam in Yisrael. The Torah is concerned about what a person can afford, what they can't afford, what's available, what's not available. You're on holiday, you can't get the other one. So these are all things one could address the best with their own rabbi. But he lays it all out over here. So that tin tuna requires proper supervision is not surprising. Obviously, I mean, they go out there, it's done in mass these days. They actually have canning factories on the ships, literally on the ships, in certain parts of the world. Mostly, I think it's done in Asia these days, in like Indonesia, in that area. That tin tuna requires proper supervision, not surprising, but why would the Johannesburg Beth Din provide two options, the Bishul Yisrael Mahadrin option and the regular option, and what is the difference? And here he starts to give the background.
Well, the Mahadran would be the
on tuna?
higher.
I don't know if there'll be 7 options on tuna.
The better supervised, right?
Meat maybe, but not tuna.
Why does tuna?
Okay. So let's
why
watch what
do
he
you
says.
need extra supervision on tuna?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So there's going to be a few issues that will come up over here. Okay. There's going to be a few. There's going to be a few different issues. There's a few different issues over here that come up. The one is, as we said, the prohibition of bishul akuma. I'm looking for it says one, which restricts eating food cooked by a Gentile. And the other is ascertaining that the tins indeed only contain kosher species of fish in them. Where they cast their nets over there in the big seas and they're working in mass production, sometimes it's possible for other species to get in. Who says, and especially after you've skinned it and you've deboned it and you've done it in mass, how do you know that every single fish that you've taken care of, it's not me and you going into a Dunkel fish shop and we can see exactly which fish we're buying and we can identify it by the skin and by the different signs, and the guy takes it and
it looks like in that thing you said that the people on the boat pick it out.
They pick it out, yeah. So let's see, let's see what he says here. So the first thing he addresses,
because they basically watch what the fishes that come in, and they actually hand select them.
He's going to mention it right here in this. It's a lovely letter, and if anybody wants to get a copy of it, if you didn't get a copy direct, I'll do that. I'm happy to do that. Right now it's on the screen on the Zoom, but other than that, you can have one. Okay, so no, but it's important to see that we're going to get to the Unterste Shura. Bishul Akum, the Gemara in Tractate Avodah Zarah 38a. So you see, he's quoting almost exactly where we are, which is why I brought it here. Teaches that in certain cases you cannot consume food cooked by a Gentile, even if the raw ingredient on its own is perfectly kosher. And it comes from, there were different reasons, different rules were made. We saw that in our Gemara. In this particular case, when it came to Bishul Akum, like we said, the wine had its reason of idolatry, the cheese and the milk had a reason. The reason for Bishul Akum was lest dining with Gentiles and food which they prepared could lead to assimilation with them. And this prohibition is known as Bishul Akum, or literally Gentile cooking. So the main reason for this gezerah, for this decree, was to avoid fraternizing and social intermingling. And therefore they slapped this decree, this ban on food cooked by the neighbors. We were at that time, we had our people where we were living, and then we had our Gentile neighbors, and the ban on cooking, consuming or eating food that they cooked was based on the fact that if there would be too much social interaction, then there would be a risk of assimilation. Now, that was the reasoning of our sages. Once the reason is in place, it's coming from, once the reason is in place, the decree itself is the decree stands. It's not for us to say, well, if I have more control than other people, then it doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't apply to him. It only applies to weak people who are going to so-called end up falling in love and marrying somebody because they had a meal with them. It doesn't work like that. When our sages made a decree or a gezerah, the decree would stand in any event. However, there are two criteria for a cooked item to be considered bishul akum and forbidden. And here it talks, the one is that it must be a food that most people won't eat in its raw state, which is quite interesting, because lately we've started eating certain fishes in their raw state. Last night I was sashimi.
Also tuna.
Absolutely, people eat tuna in its raw state. However, it's based. Sorry. No. We're not saying that you cannot eat it in its raw state. We're saying that the criteria for it to have an issue of bishul akum when it's cooked is it must be a food that most people do not eat in the raw state. If it's a food that most people eat raw, then bishul akum doesn't apply.
Hearing.
Yes.
Or
So picking. Is that you? Okay, sorry. Yeah. So if it's a food that most people would not eat in the raw state, and B is if it's a highly respectable food, because if you're talking about social issues, that our reason for telling people not to utilize this food is it might lead to social interaction. It must be a food that people will dine with. You know, if you're taking an important guest out to dinner, you're not going to give them a packet of chips. There's certain foods you might not give them. You're not going to buy them a hot dog. You're going to offer them a choshev meat. You're going to offer them something important. So there's two things. A is a food that most people would not eat in its raw state. So like tuna is an example. Although lately people have started eating raw tuna and raw salmon because the customs of the Asian areas of the world have reached us. You know, everyone's enjoying each other's type of cuisine. So you'll go to a function. I was at one last night where they serve that, what do they call it? Sashimi, those little blocks of raw salmon that's just been cured, or else tuna is served like that as well. Yeah. But that's still not the main way tuna is eaten. We can all agree that most people eat tuna cooked. If you ask your average person in a quiz, is this a food that's eaten raw, or is this a food that's eaten cooked? It would fill the criteria of a food that is eaten cooked. So from that point of view, it needs to be Bishul Yisrael. It needs to be cooked by a Jew. And then the second issue is it a highly respectable food that you would serve on a king's table? What is the status of that particular food? And I think in today's day and age, yes, because it is a very choshev food. Go check out the prices of a tuna steak. It's quite serious. The reason for the first criterion is if a food was normally eaten raw, then cooking is not really enhancing and changing the status of the food. And the second is if it were not a highly respectable food to serve, we don't have to be concerned that eating it could somehow lead to intermingling. A person wouldn't invite other people to join them for such a meal. But if both criteria are met, would the food be cooked by the Gentile become then the food cooked by the Gentile becomes forbidden. If only one of these criteria are met, then the food may be cooked by a Gentile and the food may be consumed. Like you get a famous argument between kashrut authorities about crisps. Some of them allow crisps, even though they may not be Bishul Yisrael. There are today in the big religious communities in the world, you can find crisps that were from a factory that had a Jew turn on the ovens. That's Bishul Yisrael.
But isn't that the criteria that a Jew had to just initiate the cooking process?
But what if he didn't? And it was chips. What if the factory doesn't have a Jew initiating the process? So there is a
That's what
view.
you're talking about bread the other day.
Right, but now I'm using an example of chips. If we use the example of chips, crisps. So some people will say that that's a snack. It's not a kosher food. You're not going to sit down with King George. If you were having dinner with King George, he wouldn't serve you chips. Other people will say, well, I mean crisps. I'm calling them chips. I mean crisps in this context. I think chips would. Then the other issue is it the food itself or is it the way it's prepared? Because that's another issue. For instance, crisps, let's be more particular. Crisps is a snack, like we're having them now as a snack. However, the same raw material, potato, can be used to make very important foods. Latkes, kugel, regular chips, I think, are considered important nowadays. People will order chips in a fancy restaurant and will serve kosher guests, important guests that. So anyway, this is all these different criteria that are spoken of. If both criteria are met, the food cooked by the Gentile was forbidden. If only one of them are met, the food may be cooked by a Gentile and the food may be consumed. Therefore, in order to decide, so he comes back to his tuna, to decide whether tin tuna must be cooked by Jews, whether it's Bishul Yisrael to prevent Bishul Akum, or no such precaution is necessary, we first have to understand the process by which tin tuna is produced. So now he moves from the halacha to the manufacturing process. The process of tin tuna. In a tuna factory, the fillets are steamed, which causes them to be slightly cooked. Then after the tuna is cut and canned, it's retorted. That is a type of cooking by pressure inside the cans, which is a regular cooking process. So you have basically two types of cooking. And based on all of this, first of all, he gives a reason to say tin tuna is not subject to Bishul Akum. So first of all, there are people who will say that tin tuna is not subject to Bishul Akum at all. Why? Because the prohibition of Bishul Akum includes cooking, roasting, frying, and baking. We talk about common ways of cooking. Cooking and roasting and baking are all in an oven or on top of an oven on a fire. Frying, we have particular ways when we talk about cooking. When people come with, how would you call it, more modern and strange forms of cooking, like if you found a solar cage that cooks, or air fryers, so there would be a dispute as to whether that's considered bishul. Is that, according to the halachas, the laws of bishul of cooking, is that considered bishul? I mean, somebody just before mentioned, I heard just before when we were talking about herring, that herring is eaten in its raw state. We don't cook it, but herring is usually pickled. And pickling for a 24-hour period, according to halacha, equates bishul. That says kovush k'mavushal damya. 24 hours of pickling is the same as cooking.
But it's not considered for Bishul Akum.
Yeah. The prohibition of Bishul Akum includes cooking, roasting, frying, and baking. It does not, you're right, absolutely. It does not include pickling, salting, or cold smoking, as you just said. And there is a halachic dispute. Yeah. There's a halachic dispute as to whether steaming is included in the prohibition. So we're very clear about the different types of cooking, that they are what we define as cooking. And we're very clear about the fact that pickling, salting, and cold smoking are not considered cooking for Bishul Akum. But what about steaming? Steaming is a new way of cooking. And is steaming considered bishul? So we can either accept an opinion that steaming is not considered cooking, and then there would be no problem of Bishul Akum, because we taught cooking is done with steam. So basically, that would give us an out on tuna having to be Bishul Yisrael. However, since the tuna is steamed when it's already packaged in a tin, you can have a problem that although steaming might not be considered cooking, that's when maybe you're steaming something directly. Like people sometimes nowadays will steam vegetables. And then you might have a question whether that act of cooking with steam is considered cooking. But now that you've put the tuna in a can, and the can is sealed. You know, they have these plants on the ships, and the can is sealed. What are you really doing? You're subjecting the can to heat. It might make no difference where the heat's coming from. The fact that it's steam instead of fire might make no difference whatsoever. So even if we accept the opinion that steaming is not considered cooking, since the tuna is steamed, packaged in a tin, it might not be considered
steamed first.
Yeah, it would
put it in the tins.
It would seem once before and once after. Yeah, once before and once after.
Why did you do that? Why would it be necessary to do both processes?
Why they need to do that?
Is it to basically stop it going off, maybe?
I'm not sure. He doesn't. He doesn't
procedure
say.
But then why do it then?
They must have reason.
Cutting. It doesn't explain why they need to do it this way. You're asking why it has to be done twice. Yeah. Maybe it has to do with the plant, that they don't have the equipment as they catch it to do the full steaming, so they sort of get it together, consolidate it. But I'm not sure about that.
They spoil it if it's
Yeah,
cooked
yeah.
like that. Whereas in a-
Since the tuna is steamed when it's already packaged in the tin.
Just
Yeah,
only
yeah.
juices
Mhm.
and the brine or the water or
Okay,
the oil.
so then you can look at it.
Depends how it's packaged.
That's right. If you look at it from the other angle, that the tuna is steamed already, packaged in the tin, and it's not truly a steam cooking process because the steam is directly cooking the tuna, not cooking the tuna, but the heat of the can, then consequently it could be considered an ordinary cooking and would be subject to Bishul Akum. And back to our Gemara. However, there's another way of looking at this. The Gemara there in Avodah Zarah teaches that if food is salted by a Jew or a non-Jew to the point that it is edible, then even if a non-Jew subsequently cooks it, we say the food remains acceptable and there's no prohibition of Bishul Akum. There's another out, that if somebody goes and salts raw food and brings it to edible level, this might be a little bit like when they cure the salmon and get it ready to be eaten, then it's no longer subject to Bishul Akum. Bishul Akum needs to take it from the absolute raw state into the cooked state. And based on some authorities maintain that since the tuna is pre-steamed in the factory, in the first stage of the process, before the fish is cut and tinned, it already became edible at that stage. And therefore the second cooking in the tin doesn't change its status and the food cannot become forbidden under Bishul Akum. This line of reasoning is valid according to the opinion that steaming is similar to salting, which is not subject to Bishul Akum. So can you see how many different, it just shows you what's very nice about the way he presents this letter is it gives people an idea of how much goes into a final decision. That it's not just willy-nilly, that when they sit down there and they decide to place their stamp, a lot of thought and a lot of work goes into it.
Only
Yeah.
the decision in general for the method of cooking, not only for the South
And-
African
yeah.
market. It's in
Yeah, no, look, they might,
today the new
Yeah.
way of cooking by steaming or by I don't know.
right, but they have to make their decision for their constituency. It could be that it differs from a decision that another kashrut authority might make in another part of the world. Like the OU, which is a very broad kashrut organization in America, might take, let's say, on any issue, a different line. But they have to have sources. Minchas Yitzchak, sorry? We'll summarize in the end, so don't worry, don't get too perturbed. The Minchas Yitzchak presents this rationale and says that since there's a situation of cooking in a commercial setting, there is no Bishul Akum, as we don't know the identities of the one who cooking the food. That, by the way, it also comes up in our Gemara that perhaps when the rabbis made their ban for social reasons and social purposes on food prepared by Gentiles, perhaps their intention was only private people, where social interaction is a risk. But when you talk about companies and you don't even know who made it, because when you go into the store, it doesn't say on every can or on everything that you buy that this is who cooked it. So maybe that whole issue falls away altogether. And this comes up with a lot of those bans that may be commercial when it comes to bread, for instance. Halachically, there's a view that pas akum applies, bread baked by Gentiles applies to private bread baked by Gentiles for their own family or for sale, but not to a commercial factory, Albany or Blue Ribbon or whatever who baking, and who are subject. Yeah.
So what was it? Like, as opposed to king, which can
That's a proper
may not
kosher.
be kosher as a fish.
Yeah.
Like the whole Gemara talks
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
But tuna itself as a fish is kosher.
I think there are tunas that aren't. I think there are some tunas that aren't. I think there are. I think there are tunas that aren't.
To stay smooth.
I'm a subject to suggest to checking it out. There are some tuna that aren't. And even if all tuna, let's say you could assume all was, I think what he's going to talk about lower down, I mean, we'll stop with the letter in a moment. I mean, in a few minutes, and maybe give everyone an opportunity to see it and read it yourselves. We're just sampling it because it's a long letter with a lot of details. But there's also other kinds of fish that come up in those. Don't forget, they're casting a very wide net when they fish. And the question also becomes, he deals with that over here as well. How do they know that they're getting
fish paste.
Yeah. By the way, the fish paste, I don't know if it's still for sale because I'm saying that I think it stopped. But the fish paste was never had the hechsher of the Mahatrid Commission in South Africa. Just out of interest, I have a friend who loved fish paste very much. Pex and Red Row. Yeah. Pex and Chobit and Red Row. Yeah.
Red Row.
The same fact.
So I used to love it. Oh, so I used to Red Row. Oh.
So the Minchas Yitzchak
It's
says,
the same problem. It's like sardine.
sorry, yeah, but sardines
When they
might be
bring it
different,
back,
Saul,
I'm listening at
because sardines are normally packed whole. You can actually see the sardine. With tuna, you're seeing flesh. In general, by the way, with fish, there's an issue of identifying it. If you go to a fish store, even if it's not a kosher one, and you know how to identify fish, and you can see from the skin that you're buying a kosher fish, then that's already a way to know that you're buying a kosher fish. But the moment it's either a fillet with no skin or bones, it's just, how would you call it, plain flesh, and you have no way of identifying
It has to have one side the skin on.
Yeah. And sardines in a can,
Yeah.
you can identify them in most cases, the way they pack them.
Yeah.
Oh, you got that picture on.
So there could be no issue of potential intermingling. Okay. Another reason why tin tuna does not pose a problem with Ishul Akum is that it's not oile al shulchan malachim. It's not fit to be served at the king's table. The Shulchan Aruch, based on Avodah Zarah 38a again, rules that only a dignified food that is oile al shulchan malachim, fit to be served on the king's table, is subject to Bishul Akum. In practical terms, the definition of this food in cooked food is a food that would be served at an important meal to which guests are invited. Conversely, Bishul Akum does not apply to food not fit for such a meal, since a person wouldn't invite people over for such a meal, and therefore such a meal could not lead to intermingling. And using this rule, some authorities are of the opinion that tin tuna is exempt from the requirement of Bishul Yisrael. For while some tuna can be prepared in a way that is fit to be served at a king's table, as we were saying before, sashimi and tuna steak are quite expensive, but canned tuna is a very basic staple. It's not such chances are that's not what you're going to serve in a very dignified way, unless you've got a very good recipe for
tuna lasagna.
Tuna lasagna, but generally it's a tuna sandwich on your way kind of food.
Yeah.
They argue that tin tuna is certainly not fit, as when in this form it's a very cheap food, not for South Africans but for other people in the world. At 20 rand a can, it's not.
So we're going to have to stop our tuna lunch on Fridays. We have our tuna with bagel, salmon, and cottage cheese and all that.
So I think,
it won't have the hechsher.
yeah, so you put a summary here. Conclusion for part one. Yeah, let's do the summary here. Conclusion for part one. Since the prohibition against Bishul Akum is not biblical, it's not midoraisa, but it's a rabbinic prohibition, Bishul Akum, cooking by Gentile, and there are many authorities to rely on for all kinds of leniencies. This is how you build a case. Therefore, we've got strong grounds to be lenient on the issue of bishul akum vis-a-vis tin tuna. So in other words, he built a case, and the bottom of that first case is that there is a lot to rely on if you want to use tuna that is not bishul Yisrael. And then he deals with, as a second matter, kosher fish, that not all species of fish are kosher, and it must have fins and scales to be kosher. And how do we know what the fishing net is going to catch in mass? A fishing net inevitably catches a small amount of other fish, and these varieties will be added in. So there might be times when non-kosher fish is mixed in the same net as the kosher variety. So how would we know that only kosher fish, in our case tuna, ends up in our tin cans of tuna? And the simple answer is the standard practice in the fish industry is to hand sort the catch. Somebody was saying that before, several times to remove the foreign fish from the main catch. The sorting is intended to ensure that only the desired variety of fish is sent to the plant before the process begins. And part of this also is that normally companies are worried about their reputation. For instance, if they're going to allow, like, I don't know what, sea snails and who knows what else to be allowed into the mix, and it's now when it's eels and whatever, so when it's chunked in the can, it's definitely going to reduce the quality of that food, that you or I, or certainly a person who understands gourmet eatings, going to say, hold on a second, this is a bad quality tuna, don't buy whatever it is, triple triangle tuna. They're worried about their reputation. So we can rely also on their worry that they're going to want to sort it properly. Because Moshe Feinstein writes against identifying skin fish with a mere familiar eye, but it must possess simanim, identifying characteristics to confirm that it's from a kosher variety. When it comes to tuna, simply saying it looks like tuna will not do. I know that my son once wanted to make tuna steaks some years ago, and he asked the fishery, it wasn't a kosher fishery, if they could bring him a full slice. Now, tuna's a big fish. I think some of them are the size of half of this table. But the problem is that when they distribute it to the various fisheries, a tuna, it looks like a Scotch fillet. In fact, the person who does it might even think it's a massive fish. Yeah, it's a massive fish. So if they're selling you something that they're slicing off a big, how would you call it? It looks like a big roast. It looks like a Scotch fillet or a raisin rib. You can't tell from plain flesh exactly what it is. And even if what he just said, Reb Moshe Feinstein said, familiar eye, that a person says, I'm a chef, and I know I can see that that's tuna, I can taste that that's tuna, that's not good enough. The simanim have to be there, meaning you need them to give you a piece of tuna that's right near the end of the fish, the skin. So you can see tuna skin on it. Once you can identify from the skin that this is really a tuna, then you can.
But Rabbi, what about if just a shark slips into what about the 1/60th of it?
So
it won't affect it either.
So I hear what you're saying. So there can be bittul, but you can't rely on nullification as a first option, lechatchila. In other words, if a person made a mistake, something went wrong, and in there ended up a mixture of a piece of shark or whatever. So you know what? It could be the different types of bittul. It could be 1 in 60 and it's okay. But you can't lechatchila. That means as a first option, rely that, okay, I don't mind if some treif gets mixed in, because anyways, it's not going to be more than X percent. That's not going to help. That bittul is dependent on a mistake that was already made. But you have it. So anyway, what I can do, we don't have to go through the whole thing. It's quite long, but conclusion for part 2. Since this is a serious disagreement amongst the authorities regarding eating non-kosher fish, which is a prohibition of Torah biblical origin, it's meritorious to be stringent on this matter, as the Mahadrin line actually checks the species of the fish as well. And now that we've better explored the background to this very complex topic, we're in a better position to understand why the Beth Din provides 2 lines of tin tuna. As for the practical application of this discussion and which type of tin tuna you should purchase, we recommend that each individual consults their own rabbi for guidance. So basically, there are those that that prefer to be stringent because they will say that they don't want any risk that they are eating a fish that crayfish, shark, whatever, because that's midoraisa, that's a Torah prohibition. But he also presented a case that there's many good reason to rely on the checking systems of the canning factories.
What brought this about? So
I think they've had it for a long time.
Been kosher.
You know, then practically nothing changed.
Ah.
They're explaining, it's an explanation, and it's actually quite
Wow.
fascinating because you don't often get such a thought out pilpul that gets sent out to the public like this. But it's a beautiful example because it gives people an idea that not so simple. That's I just thought it's interesting here because it pertains to the Gemara that we're learning. It's directly involved with the Gemara that we're learning.
He's going to make people a lot more nervous now.
I don't think they should be nervous.
Now, definitely only tuna.
I'm gonna leave out the tuna. I'll go for the salmon and the.
I think it was explained very well.
But now,
No, but you might decide that you want to pay $5 more and use Mahadri commission tuna. That's your choice.
But did he list which ones? Or...
It says Bishul Yisrael on the can.
So just buy that.
I mean, we can pay
No,
choose.
everybody buys tuna and salmon.
Yeah, a bit inside.
Yeah, but I'm saying is you so reasonable.
Give it to them. Take it with you.
Okay, that was our.
I eat. I